Is the US about to experience the worst economic collapse? In our modern society, the majority of the people do not understand what the collapse of a nation is. Most of us believe in some false assumptions on what a nation or an empire's collapse looks like. This is synonymous with typical modern-day Americans who have never seen such an event, and over the years, they have been experiencing only peripheral economic crashes and crises. Because of Hollywood, most of the people still deluded to believe that economic collapse will happen overnight. It is shocking that most Americans believe that collapse cannot happen during their time, and even if it would happen, they expect a replica of what they see in Hollywood movies. They think that they would wake up one morning and find the whole world on fire. However, this is not the case based on what history has shown. A collapse of a nation is a slow process followed by a series of events, and a collapse can take many years. This is not to nullify the fact that there are regular moments of shock and awe. Certainly, we have them. The 2008 crisis is an example of these shocks where economic bubbles are artificially propelled up before they pop. Previously, we have seen the central bank intervening on these events, and history shows that the window for manipulation is always around 10 years between these economic shocks. For average people, a decade might seem like a long time, but for the elite behind the degradation of our economy, a decade is just a blink of an eye. In the meantime, warning signals are imminent. Analysts who are aware of the situation are trying to warn the populace on the underlying decay of the system and where this artificially baked system will lead us to. Great economists like Ludwig von Mises foresaw the collapses of the German mark and predicted the Great Depression, and no one listened to him until it was too late. This has repeated itself lately in 2008, where many economists predicted the crisis and derivatives crash, and no one listened until it was too late to take any actions. Most people simply ignored it because they took things normally and did not accept the facts presented in front of them. We have many factors that cause mass blindness to societal and economic realities. First, the elites who control the system deliberately creates the illusion of prosperity by rigging the economic data to the upside. History has shown that in almost every case of economic crisis or a geographical disaster, usually the general public is contained to believe that they are in the midst of peace or an economic boom. They are encouraged to ignore any fundamental warning signs in favor of putting their faith in the system. Usually, in these situations, the few people who break the apathy and expose the truth are called doom-monger or Chicken Little. In the midst of cheerful lemmings from the deluded general public, a collapse is something that is very obvious, and most think that they would recognize it once they saw it. This is like trying to teach a blind person about colors. It is almost impossible to get all these Helen Kellers to understand that what they perceive is not the reality of things. There is a vast world hidden from them, and they have no clue on how to understand what is going on. Crash events can happen in a series of stages in the process of collapsing until the final stage where a moment of reality is created for everyone, even those who blindly ignored the indicators and warnings. There is a reason why the elites governing our system put a lot of effort into hiding the real data on the state of our economy. It is not that they are retrying to prevent the system from collapsing by exploiting public ignorance. Rather, a crash event is a tool, a means to an end, as Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr. wanted after the Panic of 1920. Under the Federal Reserve Act, panics are scientifically created. The present panic is the first scientifically created one, worked out as we figure a mathematical problem. The central bankers and the cohorts always manipulate the economic data to promote a false notion of economic boom before almost any major economic crash because they want to ambush the ignorant populace. Their goal is to create panic among people and then use it to their own advantage as they rebuild and mutate the system into a new thing that could not be recognized only a decade ago. Each crash, however insignificant it may look, builds a series of steps to a point where things cannot be rectified, to a point where the society we once had is barely a distant memory. The steps culminating in the final collapse of a nation can take many decades, and the US has been subject to it for quite some time now. As it has previously happened in history, in 2019 we have experienced manipulation of economic data, and a lie on economic boom is being perpetrated in the mainstream media. The public was becoming more aware of the poor economic performance, and they had to be subdued using manipulated data. Specifically, the conservatives were becoming too aware of the danger, and they had to be subdued in favor of the system. The sad truth is that the propaganda of the economic boom is more prominent today among the conservatives, who are trying to ignore the fundamental factors as a way of defending Trump's administration. These are the same people who pointed out economic bubbles under the Obama administration, and with Trump's government, they are denying the existence of any bubbles. In his campaign, Trump himself argued that the markets are a dangerous fraud created by the Federal Reserve, yet after taking the office, he flip-flopped everything and he began taking credit for the bubble. What is mind-boggling is that most of the people, even those in the liberty movement, are still dismissing this behavior in favor of worshipping Trump as a hero in the White House. This only reinforces the argument that the system is due for another major crash event, and all these are accelerating the eventual collapse of the U.S. Every case of an economic collapse in modern history has always been preceded by peak delusional optimism and high levels of greed. At one point, those vigilant against any crisis suddenly capitulate and claim victory. This is when the reality strikes hardest. When it comes to determining how long an empire will last, one has to take into account the agenda being driven by the elites who control various institutions. As long as greedy are in key positions, it doesn't take long before some of them inject their own evil agendas that corrupt the whole system. Can they prolong and starve a crisis? Yes, they can do this in the short term. However, once the collapse machine has been set on motion, the best thing they can do is try to slow things, but eventually, the collapse will happen. It is always said that the elites are going to keep the plates spinning on the economy and that they don't want to lose their golden goose. They are able to keep everything afloat because they have a very useful political puppet in the form of Donald Trump. He is useful because he inspires a sharp national division, being a self-proclaimed conservative champion and nationalist. If the elites keep things going, the crisis will not be triggered during the Trump administration, and this will give the public an impression that conservative is ideal and that the national sovereignty works. This is the opposite of their true agenda. Why would globalists that want the erasure of the nation and the creation of a centralized socialist utopia seek to make conservatives and nationalists look good? Well, they can't do it. The banks are only concerned with how they will avoid the blame when their engineered collapse of the old world order hits the public with increasingly painful consequences that are already becoming visible. The upcoming crash has already begun in the form of plunging fundamentals, and far too many conservatives are placing their heads in the sand for the selfish sake of proving the political underperformance. The decline in U.S. manufacturing, freights, global exports, mass closure in the U.S. retail sector, as well as all-time highs in consumer debts, corporate debts, and national debt are being rationalized and shrugged as nothing but just a few hiccups in an otherwise booming country. The Fed's repo market purchases is barely keeping up with demand from liquidity-starved corporations is also being trashed by the authority. Analysts and conservatives should stop supporting Trump, who is a Rothschild proxy, and start acknowledging the reality of the current situation. The only question now is whether the elites will allow the crush to spread into the main street and affect the markets before the upcoming 2020 elections. It is very clear that to predict the timing of the collapse of a nation, one has to examine the agenda of the ruling minorities who dominate various key institutions within the country. We can gain a sense of timing from the admission of global public institutions like the IMF and the UN. Each of these institutions has already announced that 2030 is the target date for the globalization of various sustainability goals worldwide. This means that the American elites have around 10 years to create a crisis and then solve it with globalism. A decade might seem too long for everyone else, but to these policymakers, it is a very narrow window for the policymakers to straighten things. If they intend that the conservatives take the blame for the next crash, this means that they will have to initiate it soon. They may not have any other choice, since the chain of dominoes was already set in motion by the Fed back in 2018 with its liquidity tightening policies. We can almost perfectly predict the timing of collapse to a certain degree by understanding various tactics used by the authority to hide what they are doing behind the scenes. As usual, when a collapse is about to accelerate, the policymakers tend to use crisis events as a cover to distract the public from understanding the reality. These events will trigger the collapse and make things happen very fast. For example, war with Iran or a no-deal Brexit can be very critical in accelerating the collapse. We can also automatically guess that the administration will need a scapegoat, and it appears that the conservatives and nationalists are their targets to place the blame on. This leaves 1 year for a crisis if Trump is intended to leave the White House in 2020, or less than 4 years if he will be re-elected for the second term. Keep in mind that a lot can happen within 1 year, and a second Trump's term is not yet guaranteed. But why should a crash be created in the first place? An economic crash event offers an opportunity to the establishment to consolidate the control over hard assets as poverty forces the general population to sell the little they have in order to survive. This economic downturn also creates fear, which makes the population malleable and easy to control. Because of what is brought about by a crash, doors are opened to various political and social changes which end up in more centralization of power and less freedom. Generally, collapse is a series of successive crashes that can lead to complete erasure of the original society. It is not a Mad Max event, it's a hidden and insidious cancer that takes over the national body and wraps it into wretched form. A collapse is said to be complete when the nation breaks apart or when damaged for so long that no one can remember what it used to look like before. What our society is experiencing today is the beginning of a new crash and can lead to a phase of collapse of our way of life. The economic boom narrative among the conservatives is a trick designed to make everyone complacent. The bubble that we warned about under the Obama administration has been propelled under Trump's administration. Nothing has changed in 10 years since the 2008 crash except that the motivation to keep any crash hidden is quickly disappearing. In conclusion, crashes are inevitable in any nation, but a collapse only happens when the public remains unprepared and ignorant. We can say that our civilization and values are under attack but can only be destroyed if we stay apathetic to this threat and refuse to take necessary actions to neutralize it. We must adopt a decentralization system as a way of creating localized and self-sufficient economies, as well as the adoption of a localized production structure. On top of this, we also have to prepare for any eventualities. The fate of the US economy has already been sealed, but the few greedy people who are trying to destroy it before they force everyone into a bad situation. Always remember that we are living in the midst of an epic moment, and the outcome of the collapse will depend on how we react to the current economic threats. This will not be done by the next generation, but reforms have to take place in our time.